What's a code type?
A code type, let me think of how to explain this very, very simply. So the main scales, and I keep referring to scales, these are just the main scores that come up on this test. We can refer to them as codes. And when I was saying that Ms. Heard's scores could be compared to certain groups of people that had been researched before to obtain similar scores, the research has shown that certain people will have certain scores that kind of spike on this, okay? And so all of those traits that I was describing, those are traits that are found in these code types. So it means that score number two was high, and score number 6 was high. And so if we have those two scores were both high, then that's a 2-6 code type. And these code types...
What code type was Ms. Heard?
Ms. Heard had the clearest code type was 3-6, but then she also had some other code types that were less significant.
What characteristics are associated with a 3-6 code type?
So a 3-6 code type, a lot of that anger is expressed in this code type. There can be actually a lot of cruelty, usually with people who are less powerful. Actually, when you see this code type, you want to, if you can, to follow up with subordinates, co-workers, people who may have observed their behavior more closely. The 3-6 code type is very concerned with their image, very attention-seeking, very prone to externalizing blame to a point where it's unclear whether they can even admit to themselves that they do have responsibility in certain areas. A lot of suppressed and denied anger, but the anger is very present, will explode out, and a lot of issues in their close relationships.
How does Ms. Heard's code type fit in with your overall opinion as to personality disorders?
Well, this might be an appropriate time to describe a little bit about these personality disorders, because I think what you'll hear is that there's a lot of consistency there. So borderline personality disorder is a disorder of stability. It's instability, and it's instability in personal relationships. It's instability in their emotions. It's instability in their behavior, and it's instability in their sense of self and their identity. And that instability is really driven by this underlying terror of abandonment. So one of the key features also of this disorder, and all of it is like pistons of an engine kind of firing off and igniting one another. But when somebody is afraid of being abandoned by their partner or by anybody else in their environment, and they have this disorder, they'll make desperate attempts to prevent that from happening. And those desperate attempts could be physical aggression, it could be threatening, it could be harming themselves. But these are behaviors that are usually very extreme and very concerning to the people around them.
Before we move on to that,
okay.
Are you familiar with the term emotional reactivity?
I am.
What is that?
So emotional reactivity is very common in the diagnosis. So essentially, like I said, there's instability in emotions. People with borderline personality disorder are often misdiagnosed as having bipolar disorder because they can be up and down. They can look very depressed, then they can look very elated, but these changes are happening within a matter of hours. Somebody with bipolar disorder, this is a clinical depression lasting days, weeks. What struck me was Ms. Raquel Pennington's testimony. She's a former friend of Ms. Heard's, and she told a story about, I suppose they were shopping for Thanksgiving accoutrements, something to prepare for Thanksgiving, and Ms. Heard struck her in the face, sort of out of the blue, which is, I thought was interesting, because that is one of those signs of borderline personality disorder where if a friend or a loved one isn't meeting your needs in that moment, people with borderline personality disorder can be very caring in their relationships as long as their needs are being met. They feel that their needs should be met when they want them met at a specific level. And if they're not, then that anger, that sense of harm causes them to react. In psychology, we would describe this more as sophistication. So street smart, so to speak. The way, for instance, I've had many clients who have borderline personality disorder who are messy and really clearly suffering, and they might be difficult and all over the place and yell at you in the middle of a session, but it's so, it's not tailored. It's so much easier to work with because of that just openness and rawness of it, genuineness. Sometimes you'll have a more sophisticated presentation. There are 9 symptoms and only 5 have to be met. So there are a lot of different combinations and different ways it can present. And sometimes you'll have more of a petulant version of this, where it really shows when you push the button and you're kind of, whoa, what was that? So somebody who's really productive, high functioning, successful, and you get to know them and you think they're fantastic because they're so interested in you too. And you might not realize it, but they're mimicking you perfectly. So you're really just kind of falling in love with this new friend who is being you. Ms. Heard did not have PTSD, and there were also pretty significant indications that she was grossly exaggerating symptoms of PTSD when asked about them.
You mentioned nightmares as well.
Yes.
Did she recount for you the nature of the nightmares?
So they were vague. She indicated that she has recurrent nightmares and that she feels as though she's being held down. There was some conflict in that account because even though that could be a PTSD symptom, it is fairly vague, but I still scored it as present. And in her initial treatment with Dr. Bonnie Jacobs, which I believe started before she began dating Mr. Depp, she had indicated to Dr. Jacobs, according to Dr. Jacobs's notes, that she was having repetitive nightmares back then and that they were related to her childhood trauma. And so that came up several times in the notes. Dr. Jacobs kept mentioning that. Ms. Heard, in her own self-report, stated to me that when she first got to LA, she was seeking treatment for, in her words, blanket anxiety and depression. She also reported that she was taking medications. In general, none of them were helpful. That's actually very typical of borderline personality disorder. Medications typically aren't very helpful for somebody with the disorder. They really need an intensive, lifelong type of therapy, which is not necessarily as relevant to this. But interestingly also, people with borderline personality disorder often respond really positively to stimulant medications that are given for ADD or ADHD. And in one of Nurse Filati's notes, she reported that Ms. Heard told her that none of the medications were working for her except for one Provigil, which is often prescribed as a stimulant medication. And I just thought that was interesting and sort of consistent with more of these lifelong personality disorders that aren't necessarily caused by a harm by any allegations, but have been there and will remain there typically.